That tower wasn't just an architectural structure, it was a symbol of power, a dream wrapped in marble, a place where only the wealthiest in the city were ever invited to step inside. Every pane of glass reflected light so brilliantly that anyone dressed less than perfectly looked like a color grading error in a meticulously edited photograph. In that space, even breathing demanded an air of elegance. And then the automatic doors opened to reveal someone no one had expected: Julia Bennett. There were no high heels clicking against the stone floor, only the soft steps of worn-out flats, a simple linen dress wrinkled at the folds, and a canvas tote on her shoulder stained with faded paint marks. She bore none of the markers of someone who belonged here. No diamond ring, no designer bag, no trail of expensive perfume. But her eyes, the only thing that seemed untouched by wear, scanned each column ceiling motif and cut of glass as though redrawing them in her mind with an invisible brush. The people in the lobby, men in tailored Italian suits, women in sparkling bodycon dresses fit for a gala, paused their conversations not out of curiosity but irritation. A few glances skimmed over her, like silent knives, sharp, cold, and heavy with judgment. Who walks into this place, looking like they just came from the grocery store? A woman whispered, laced with mild disgust. Julia heard it, but she didn't react. She simply walked slowly, her back straight, never lowering her gaze to avoid theirs. Her eyes weren't on the people, but on the space itself, as if she were analyzing the opulence, dissecting each layer of glamour, each mismatched detail of lighting and structure. No one knew who she was, and they believed that alone was reason enough to judge her. Yet it was her stillness, that quiet refusal to explain herself, that made the entire lobby subconsciously uneasy. Julia didn't disrupt the order of this place with action. She simply existed, and that presence alone was enough to begin cracking the false perfection of this world, piece by piece. She had stood there for barely a minute, yet had already become the subject of hushed conversations, not because her presence was strange, but because it completely defied every unspoken rule of this place. A receptionist in an emerald green bodycon dress, a gold-plated name tag around her neck, swept her gaze over Julia as if scanning an alien object within the luxury ecosystem she was paid to protect. That look held no curiosity, no hint of goodwill. It was simply a verdict, without a trial: you don't belong. A faint razor-thin smile appeared on her lips, like a blade's edge, while her eyes lingered just a moment too long on the wrinkled linen dress, as if to emphasize the contrast between the woman who entered and the place she dared to enter. In the corner of the lobby, two men holding glittering champagne flutes turned their eyes toward Julia. One of them, dressed in a navy suit with a silk tie, squinted, leaned toward his friend, and sneered. "Is she for real? She doesn't look like she can afford the valet, let alone a unit here." The other younger man gave a faint laugh and raised his glass as if to toast the joke. "Maybe she's just looking for shelter from the rain," he murmured, his eyes fixed on Julia's faded shoes. Julia heard it all, or at the very least, she was sensitive enough to feel the contempt floating around her like deliberate black strokes across a blank canvas. But she didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't lower her head. Her hand remained gently on the strap of her bag, chin lifted and gaze calm, like someone standing before a painting she'd seen 100 times and still found lacking in depth. To others, that silence might have looked like weakness, but to Julia, it was a choice, a way to make them hear the crudeness of their own words more clearly. Her quiet, seemingly invisible presence was challenging the entire room to confront itself. And while everyone continued to look at her as though she were trespassing into the domain of the accomplished. Julia looked back not with defiance, but with the eyes of an artist studying the structure of a painting that had long been overrated. Amid the whispers, scrutinizing stares, and waves of quiet contempt pulsing through the air, Julia walked slowly toward the reception desk. There was no hesitation in her step, no sign of someone who had lost her way. She stood across from the woman in the emerald dress, the one who had just moments ago bestowed upon her a look of pure disdain, and gently spoke, "I'd like to see the penthouse." Her voice wasn't loud nor sharp, but it rang out with clarity like a bold brushstroke on an otherwise washed-out canvas. And then it was as if someone had pressed pause on the room. Every gaze turned toward her, not because they were intrigued by what she had said, but because they couldn't quite believe they had heard it. The receptionist froze for a second, then let out a soft laugh like she had just heard a harmless joke. She quickly slipped back into her professional tone, tinged with mockery. "I'm sorry, miss, but the penthouse floor is only accessible to guests with VIP invitations." Several people nearby jumped in like wolves, catching the scent of entertainment. A man in a coffee-brown suit nudged his friend with his elbow and laughed. "Did you hear her? She wants to see the penthouse." A woman nearby, clad in a crystal-studded black dress, held her champagne lazily and delivered her insult without even trying to disguise it. "I suppose she plans to buy it with paint." Maybe Julia didn't flinch. She showed no trace of embarrassment or confusion as they expected. She simply tilted her head, as if quietly observing their reactions, committing them to memory for a future painting. Then she spoke, not to explain herself, but as if sharing something personal. "I just want to see if the light in the room suits my painting corner." Her words were so soft, they could have been drowned out by the clink of glass, yet they landed squarely at the center of every prejudice in the room. A man behind her sneered, "A painting corner in the penthouse," then burst into laughter as if he'd just witnessed a laughably bad magic trick. But Julia didn't laugh. She simply stood still, composed, as though she had just asked the most natural question in the world. And in that moment, the people around her began to realize they weren't facing a delusional dreamer, but someone who simply wasn't afraid of being judged. Someone who truly desired something they believed only people like them were allowed to want. And that more than anything was what made them begin to feel the loss of control. The atmosphere in the lobby had shifted, no longer soft whispers, but a full-blown performance of open disdain. A male staff member, in a crisp white shirt, clipboard in hand, gave Julia a once-over and murmured to the receptionist, "Should I check her invitation code?" The question was asked just loudly enough for those nearby to hear. The receptionist shrugged, her tone casual with a hint of ridicule. "If she were legit, we'd have seen it by now." And with that, a ripple of laughter spread like champagne bubbles, elegant enough not to seem crude, yet sharp enough to shatter a fragile heart. Near the model suite display, a middle-aged couple. The man in an emerald suit, holding a gold-handled cane, glanced at Julia. He muttered to his wife, "She looks like the maid from our beach estate, though even she dresses better." The wife took a swift look at Julia's canvas bag, exhaled a short chuckle, and tilted her diamond-studded wrist ever so slightly as if it were a response. Julia remained standing, her fingers gently tightening around the strap of her bag, her eyes drifting across the expansive lobby, not lost, but composed in a strangely serene way. Before her stretched a space, gleaming with tailored suits and gowns like living mirrors, yet underneath it all was a thick layer of dust of pretense. And she, in her wrinkled linen dress and weathered eyes, was the only real thing there. The receptionist turned back this time with a more assertive gaze. "We're currently attending to scheduled clients. If you don't have an official invitation, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the area." Her voice was syrupy sweet, like artificial sugar, but laced with a freezing command. Julia shifted slightly to make room for two women carrying Hermes bags as they passed, offering no resistance. She wasn't the kind to shout about justice in a place that didn't even know what fairness meant. But that very calmness only made the crowd more agitated because they expected her to get angry, flustered, apologetic, or at the very least, to leave. But she did none of those things. She simply stood there like a crack that couldn't be patched on a wall, plastered with status and arrogance. And in that moment, every smirk around her, whether smug or cruel, began to fade against the force of a presence so quiet and so real. When Julia still didn't leave, as if waiting for something no one could quite understand, the receptionist began to show signs of impatience. Another employee, slender, wearing a tiny name tag pinned to a black blazer, hurried over to the desk and handed a glossy brochure to her colleague. They exchanged a few hushed words, and then the receptionist turned back with a smile that had been reprogrammed, outwardly friendly but hollow on the inside. "We understand you might be looking for a more suitable space," she said, her tone as gentle as if addressing a lost child. "Here's a list of suburban properties, also lovely but more practical." She slid the brochure toward Julia as though offering a charitable gift. On it was the image of a small home with a flower-filled front yard beneath which was a clearly labeled discounted price. Julia looked at the flyer in a slow, steady breath. No one could tell what she was thinking. Not anger, not bitterness, not even a flicker of pity. Only silence. A silence like a still lake, reflecting the true faces of those who tried to mask their arrogance with polite, empty gestures. She reached out and took the flyer wordlessly. The motion was so gentle, it made the staff member hesitate, because they had braced themselves for resistance or discomfort, not for a calm that made it seem like Julia was the one granting them the chance to play the role of the kind stranger. The flyer slipped into the canvas bag at her side like an unnecessary detail in a painting already complete. It didn't rattle her, nor did it leave her with regret. She didn't look back at the receptionist. She didn't sigh. She simply adjusted the strap of her bag with a soft tilt of her shoulder, then remained standing as if she were waiting not for an apartment, but for a moment that would peel away all the artificial glamour closing in around her. And it was in that very moment that the mood in the room began to shift from smugness to discomfort, because no one could quite grasp how a woman so publicly humiliated could still be standing so firmly. No arguments, no tears, just a flyer and a silence so steady it made everyone start to feel that perhaps they were the ones who ought to bow their heads. Julia's presence was no longer just unusual, it had become an irritant to the entire space. She said nothing, caused no disruption, and made no move to leave. Yet her silence alone was enough to unsettle the delicate order that existed among expensive suits, carefully measured smiles, and sparkling champagne flutes. She didn't follow the unspoken exclusion rituals they usually employed to quietly drive out those who didn't belong, and that left them floundering. Near the buffet table, two women dressed like they had just stepped out of a high-fashion magazine whispered just loudly enough. One with bold red lips and a glass of sparkling wine in hand glanced at Julia and smirked. "Who goes to view a penthouse in a wrinkled linen dress that looks like she just rolled out of bed?" The other, in a pastel crystal gown, giggled and clinked glasses with her as if celebrating a silent victory. "Maybe she thinks the security guard will grant her a miracle." Their laughter echoed faintly, sharp enough to thicken the air, but Julia didn't respond. She didn't turn around, didn't flinch, because she knew those words didn't reflect her worth, they merely revealed the smallness of those who spoke them. Near the elevators, an elderly couple who had just signed in for a private tour added their own stroke to this picture of contempt. The husband, leaning on a gold-capped cane, nodded in Julia's direction and told his wife, "I think management needs to be more careful about who they let in." His wife, in a pitch-black suit, her eyes as sharp as blades, nodded in agreement and replied coldly, "If only there were a dress code for appearances." No one in the lobby spoke Julia's name, but every action, every glance, every pause was an effort to make her disappear without ever laying a finger on her. From the canapé server, who skipped her entirely, to the manager's furrowed brow upon noticing she was still there, every silent behavior carried the same command: leave. But Julia didn't leave. She stood her ground like a misdrawn line in a perfect blueprint, one no one dared erase for fear of exposing the flaw in the entire design. She no longer needed to push back because her presence, silent, unshaken, and harder to dismiss than they had imagined, had become the most unsettling form of resistance. And while those around her scrambled to prove they belonged in this space, Julia, without saying a word, without pretending to be grand, was slowly making the entire room realize that they were the ones overacting in a performance built entirely on illusion. After nearly an hour standing amidst a forest of judgmental stares and laughter sweeter than acid, Julia gently tilted her body and walked slowly out of the main lobby, not because she was giving up, but because she refused to be the backdrop for one more second of this hollow performance. She quietly turned into a side hallway to the right, a place less frequented, where light from tall glass windows poured in, unfiltered by crystal chandeliers or the shadows of people craving attention. The marble floor in that hallway was still cold, but less scrutinizing. No one laughed. No one whispered. No one rushed past with hurried arrogance. There was only Julia and the soft, breath-like rhythm of her shoes tapping against the floor, as steady and delicate as brushstrokes on canvas. She stopped beside a large window pane, gazing down at the city below, now bathed in pastel-hued afternoon sunlight. From that height, the skyscrapers turned into abstract shapes, the traffic into flickering pencil strokes, and the people into faint specks of color. Julia looked at her own reflection in the glass, a simple figure in a quiet linen dress, a faded canvas bag slung across her shoulder, hair neatly tied without style. But she didn't see someone pitiful, as others had seen her. She saw an artist still observing the light, still gathering material for an unborn masterpiece, still standing firm inside the frame of her own life. Just then, a young staff member with a name tag walked over to replace the brochure on a wooden rack nearby. He glanced at Julia, paused for half a second, as if realizing she was unlike anyone he'd ever encountered in that building. Not because she stood out, but because she never tried to, and that very refusal radiated an inexplicable aura. Their eyes met. The staffer quickly nodded, part respectful, part uncertain. Julia tilted her head slightly and returned the nod, not in blame, not in disdain, not in coldness, just one human acknowledging another. He walked away soon after, clutching his stack of papers as if he had just brushed against something sacred. Julia stood alone, once more. No one called her name. No one escorted her out. No red carpet rolled beneath her feet. But in that corner of the hallway, beneath the slanting afternoon light, filtering through towering glass, Julia remained wholly herself. She didn't need to belong anywhere, because she had never allowed any place to determine her worth. Julia remained by the towering window, her gaze not only cast over the city, but seemingly cutting through layers of the past to a place far more peaceful than this. In the fading light of late afternoon, slanting across the glass, reflecting the depth of her eyes. Another image appeared, a small orchard garden, where leaves fell slowly and the wind blew with no purpose other than to move, where sunlight wasn't meant to show off possessions, but simply to make everything look a little more beautiful. As a child, Julia had lived in silence, not out of shyness, but because she observed more than she spoke. Her grandfather, a muralist who once painted church ceilings and ballrooms for noble families across Europe, used to tell her, "Your eyes are the most precious thing you own. People can see color, but only an artist sees the weight of light." He was the first to teach her that real value isn't found in polished surfaces, but in what quietly holds them up from beneath. She remembered autumn afternoons in that garden, where the two of them would sit, and he would show her how to use dry brushes to add depth to a tree's shadow, how to mix skin tones from sunlight bouncing off leaves. But what he emphasized most wasn't technique, it was listening. You have to learn to listen to a room, to an expression, to a silence. Sometimes a painting doesn't need to tell a story. It just needs to keep someone from forgetting how they feel. That's why today, Julia didn't feel small beneath the soaring heights of the tower. She didn't feel insulted, even after an hour of quiet humiliation. Because for her, being understood was wonderful. But being misunderstood didn't mean she had to change. Those people didn't know who she was, and that changed nothing. In the reflection on the glass, Julia caught a glimpse of her younger self, a little girl with soft curls, holding a paint palette, eyes wide the first time she saw light bounce off water. That memory passed like smoke, then faded into the present, where she still stood upright, in a place that had wanted her to bow, and that in itself was a victory not over them, but over the old belief that someone dressed simply should know when to be silent and leave. But Julia wasn't going anywhere, because her presence, amid all the polished facades, was a living declaration that no one has the right to decide where you do or do not belong, unless you give them that power. The stillness in the hallway felt sealed by some invisible glue, until a very different sound echoed from the direction of the grand windows in the main lobby. First, the soft hush of a door opening, followed by the deep, deliberate footsteps of high-end leather shoes. Not the rushed gait of a late visitor, nor the uncertain shuffle of staff. These were the footsteps of someone who never needed to hurry because the place had always been waiting for him. A staff member near the reception desk, just about to pour another glass of champagne, froze mid-motion. He glanced over, eyes widening, as if he'd seen a ghost. But it wasn't a ghost. It was what every employee in the building had been trained to prepare for, but never questioned the sudden appearance of the project's most powerful investor, David Harrison. David wasn't dressed to impress. A perfectly tailored charcoal suit, crisp white shirt with the collar open, no tie, handmade Italian shoes. What made everyone stop wasn't the clothing, it was the presence. His arrival was like a high-voltage current cutting through the marble-patterned lobby, silencing conversations mid-sentence, freezing champagne glasses mid-air. No introductions were needed, no name tags. He was recognized instantly by the well-informed faces in the room. The rumors, whispers that David had been the anonymous force behind the entire development were no longer just rumors. And what intrigued everyone even more was this: he hadn't arrived with a secretary, no advisors in tow. He was looking for someone. David stopped at the center of the lobby, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. He didn't glance at the receptionist, didn't nod at the coordinator, didn't reach out for any handshakes. He simply scanned, searching. And then, in a matter of seconds, his eyes locked onto the hallway on the right, where Julia stood. Without a pause, without the slightest hint of hesitation, David strode toward it. No one understood. No one dared to intervene. No one could believe it. The most powerful man behind the project, the one media had dubbed the man who doesn't waste a second on anything unworthy, was walking straight toward the woman in the wrinkled linen dress, with the worn canvas bag, and eyes no one had dared to meet. And in that instant, in the minds of everyone who had laughed, whispered or willfully ignored Julia, only one stunned question echoed: what is happening? Nothing had changed in the architecture, the lighting, or the music, but the atmosphere, that invisible but undeniable truth-teller, had shifted entirely. And Julia, once seen as an unworthy blemish, had become the center of gravity itself, the point around which the entire room now revolved. Julia heard the footsteps. She didn't need to turn, she already knew it was him. There was a slower beat in her chest, not from anxiety, but because a memory had returned, vivid, sharp, like a painting being lifted from the wall after years under dust. She didn't have to feign surprise. Deep down, she had always known David would come, not because of power, not to prove anything, but simply because he had always shown up for her at the exact moment others thought she had nothing left. David stopped at the entrance of the hallway, and their eyes met, direct, steady, without a flicker of hesitation. Julia didn't move toward him. She didn't need to. It was David who closed the distance, one step, then two, then three. Behind him, every gaze in the lobby seemed entranced. Those who had mocked her could no longer move, no longer speak, no longer explain, only watch. Stunned as the entire project bowed to walk straight toward the woman they had tried to dismiss. He came closer, eyes never leaving Julia, not sweeping past her, like everyone else had done for the past hour, but landing on her as if she were the only real person in a world built on illusion. And then softly, in a voice low and warm, yet just loud enough for nearby staff to hear, and fall silent, he asked, "Have you been waiting long?" Julia shook her head gently. A hint of a smile touched the corner of her lips, so faint it nearly didn't exist. But David saw it. It wasn't a smile meant for anyone else, but a quiet confirmation she was still okay. And her strength, despite the mockery and scorn, was completely intact. A staff member at the start of the hallway, one who had just recently signaled that she should leave now, stepped back entirely, face paling, as he looked at David and at Julia. His eyes darted between her worn shoes and David's flawless suit, as if his mind were frantically recalculating an equation he had once thought simple. And then what no one expected became what no one would ever forget. David stepped forward one more half step, gently wrapped his arm around Julia's waist, a gesture neither loud nor dramatic, but intimate and unmistakable. No more doubt, no more denial. The woman in the faded linen dress was not an outsider, not a stray, not someone. She was the center of a world everyone else in that room had been trying to buy their way into. And he, David Harrison, had chosen her long ago, not for her appearance, not for her status, but for the one thing no wealth could ever purchase: the kind of presence that speaks without raising its voice and makes the world go still. It was as if all the sound in the room had been drained. No more murmured conversations laced with arrogance. No more suggestive clinks of champagne glasses. No more confident footsteps from those who believed they were the center of the occasion. The once vibrant lobby, just a minute ago echoing with laughter, now fell silent, like a gallery after closing time. Every eye turned toward the hallway, where the most powerful man in the building stood beside the woman they had just scorned. David looked around, not angry, not dramatic, but his gaze alone drained the color from the receptionist and the staff nearby. Then he turned toward the team that had just made them wait in the hallway. His voice, calm, yet commanding, rang out like a verdict. I asked for the penthouse to be prepared so my wife could view it in peace. That didn't happen, did it? The receptionist immediately bowed her head, her face frozen stiff. The male staffer who had earlier mocked Julia now stood paralyzed, lips slightly parted as if to speak, but no words came. David continued unfazed. She is my wife, Julia Harrison. 6 words, precise, undeniable, and they hit like thunder in a room full of wax statues. The man in the navy suit, who had once laughed at Julia's wrinkled linen dress, looked as if yanked from a dream. His champagne glass tilted slightly, hand began to tremble. The woman in the black dress, who joked Julia looked like she'd just rolled out of bed, was now speechless, eyes darting from David to Julia, then down to the faded canvas bag, as if only now seeing it for what it truly was. A shockwave rippled across the lobby. Those who had laughed now stepped back quietly. The canapé server, who had ignored her, bowed his head and stepped away as though realizing he had just slighted a queen. The most elegantly dressed guests, the ones who had walked with their chins held high, now shrank into themselves, unable to face the truth that had just shattered everything they thought was absolute. Julia remained still. Not proud, not smug. She didn't need to retaliate. She didn't need to cast triumphant glances. Her unwavering presence, her silence from beginning to end, was the most powerful response of all. While David defended her with words, Julia, through her quiet strength, delivered a lesson none of them would ever forget. A woman once dismissed for her wrinkled dress, her faded shoes, and her unbranded bag now stood as living proof. Sometimes the one most deserving of respect isn't the best-dressed person in the room, but the one who doesn't need to be to make the entire room take a long, hard look at itself. As the truth of Julia's identity was laid bare, and the whispers faded like wind retreating through city streets, she remained where she was, calm and still. But if anyone at that moment could have heard the echo of her memories, they would have understood that serenity was not born of ease. It had been forged over the years, through everyday lives lived beneath judgmental stares, and every dream dismissed as foolish. Julia wasn't born into wealth. She grew up in an old house at the edge of a forest, where winter winds crept through the doorframe and sunlight turned the color of mossy roof tiles. Her mother was a middle school art teacher, a woman who loved color, but often had to cut white paper in half just to make it last for her students. Her father, a gifted wood sculptor, left when Julia was just 8, leaving behind a dusty workshop and a little girl with a heart that longed to be seen. Since childhood, Julia had drawn the things no one else noticed: the crack in the kitchen wall, the shadow of a fallen leaf on the porch, the way light passed through a thin curtain, subtle shifts only she ever saw. Other children called her strange. Teachers said she was too focused on unnecessary details, but Julia wasn't angry. She just kept drawing in silence, not to be praised, but because if she didn't, she felt she might suffocate in a world full of noise but starved of truth. She once applied to a prestigious art school. Her portfolio was rejected with a brief note, "lacks visual impact." Julia kept that rejection letter folded inside her sketch bag for 3 years, and in those 3 years she painted in train stations, at bus stops, in cafe corners, where no one paid her, but someone always paused just for a second to look and smile. Julia never needed anyone to hand her a place on a pedestal. She built her own canvas day by day. Every rejection, every dismissive glance, every time she was ignored at a gallery became another primer coat on the foundation of a presence that today no one in that $1 million tower could deny. And perhaps that was exactly why David loved her. Not because she came from a prestigious family, not because she walked like a polished CEO, but because she walked as herself. No fanfare, no performance. Julia didn't enter his world to be elevated. She entered it to remind him some values don't exist. In contracts, they are etched into how you stand in front of those who belittle you. And she had always stood tall, even when the whole world wanted her to bow. Julia didn't meet David at a glamorous party or during a networking event among elites, nor through some calculated matchmaking arrangement like people often imagine with high-status couples. They met through a pane of glass. One drizzly afternoon, Julia stood outside the city's most prestigious art gallery, a place she hadn't been invited to yet came anyway. She wasn't dressed up, wore no makeup, just carried a rolled-up sketch and a pair of eyes full of light. She stood there for a long time, eyes fixed on a painting near the glass wall, a high-priced piece labeled with a famous artist's name. But instead of admiration, she tilted her head, slightly furrowed her brows, as if studying it with a quiet skepticism. When David stepped out from inside the gallery, their eyes met, accidentally through the glass. He saw a woman standing in the rain, not reaching for her phone, not posing, but simply observing. A look that was professional, deep, and real. David opened the door. No one did that there, but he did. He stepped beside her, looked in the same direction, and asked, "What do you think of that painting?" Julia didn't turn her head. She simply narrowed her brows and replied bluntly, "The light falls from the wrong angle." The main subjects pushed back instead of standing out. Feels like they're forcing an emotion that isn't there. David was stunned, not because she was rude, but because in his world, where people only ever said what he wanted to hear, this was the first time someone looked straight at something revered and dared to say, "It's not right." From that day, David began learning about her, not by hiring a private investigator, but by quietly showing up in the places where she painted: old parks, quiet cafes, even an abandoned train station where she once held a solo exhibit no one knew about. He never told anyone. He just stood at the edge, watching the works she'd hung with binder clips and twine, remembering every color she chose for the forgotten faces of the world. Then one day, he asked her out for coffee. She replied, "Why?" He answered, "Because you're the first person who looked at $1 million painting and said it was fake." Julia smiled. "I don't need coffee. I need a seat with good light to paint." David nodded. From that day on, he always brought coffee, along with a small lamp. Their love didn't begin with gifts or polished photo shoots. It grew in the quiet moments, Julia sketching while David sat nearby, silently reading. Through rainy afternoons where nothing was said, yet everything was understood. Most importantly, David never asked how she would fit into his world, because he knew it was precisely her refusal to fit into any mold, her quiet defiance of every expectation for a billionaire's wife, that made her unlike anyone else. Julia didn't need the spotlight to shine. She was the light, and David, a man who once had everything, chose to keep only one thing: the woman who didn't need him to prove her worth. And for that very reason, he couldn't look away. The VIP elevator opened with a chime, soft as breath, carrying Julia and David to the top floor. The manager, who had earlier kept a cold, guarded demeanor in the lobby, now followed them with hunched shoulders, voice trembling slightly as he recited each lavish detail: imported Italian stone flooring, self-adjusting solar glass, motion sensor, integrated climate control. Every sentence came with a cautious glance, as if bracing for the slightest frown from Julia to leap into apology. But Julia paid little attention. She didn't care about the sofa's brand or the rare wood used in the kitchen cabinetry. The moment she stepped into the apartment, she left that conversation behind. Her mind was captured by the only thing that ever stirred her heart, the light. She walked slowly toward the largest glass wall, where the city unfurled like a living painting. Afternoon sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor, dancing faintly on the ceiling like a silent waltz. Julia stood there, turning gently, extending her hand, palm open, to catch the slanted light, just as she had done since childhood, in the garden where her grandfather once painted portraits of diplomats. David stood behind her, not interrupting. He knew this moment wasn't his. It belonged to her and to the inspiration, returning through every subtle shimmer. "What do you think?" he asked softly like a friend, not a husband finalizing the purchase of the city's most expensive home. Julia didn't answer right away. She walked along the edge of the glass eyes, following the movement of her shadow across the floor, then finally said, without turning back, "I don't like the glossy floor. The light bounces too harshly. I need matte wood, softer, warmer, like my grandfather's old studio." The manager seemed to choke for a moment, then quickly nodded. "We'll have it replaced exactly as you prefer. The entire surface. No problem at all." He immediately pulled out his phone, murmuring commands into the system like a soldier receiving orders from a queen. Julia paid no mind to the rush behind her. She continued through the bedroom, the reading nook, until she stopped at the western balcony, where the setting sun was staining the sky with shades of amber and burnt orange. She leaned gently on the glass railing, wind brushing through her hair, her gaze calm, but glimmering not with emotion, but with mental sketches, mapping the space, measuring the angle of light, imagining where to place her easel and her paint drawers. To most, this penthouse symbolized ultimate wealth. To Julia, it was simply a room, one that if the light was soft enough and the silence deep enough, could become a studio. She didn't need it to prove her social standing. She just needed a place to quietly create beauty in a world too loud, too desperate to flaunt its price tags. And in that simplicity, the most luxurious penthouse in the city finally found its true purpose, not to showcase power, but to serve a soul that didn't need a stage, yet carried enough stillness to make an entire city stop and watch. The news spread like electricity. Within less than an hour after David revealed Julia's identity, every internal group chat, private message, and even office email thread buzzed with a single revelation: the woman with the canvas bag is David Harrison's wife. And then a mass retreat began, not from the building, but from shame. Those who had mocked her linen dress, sneered at her worn-out bag, now scrambled for ways to backtrack and apologize. The receptionist, the one who had told Julia to wait in the hallway because she had no appointment, now clutched a folder awkwardly and stepped forward to mutter, "Miss Julia, I sincerely apologize. I didn't know earlier." Julia looked at her, not angry, not condescending. She offered a soft smile and replied in a voice as gentle as morning mist, "If I really had been homeless that day, would you still be apologizing?" It wasn't a question meant to be answered. The receptionist bowed her head, stiff with realization. Julia walked past, leaving behind nothing but the quiet echo of someone strong enough not to seek revenge, yet compassionate enough to make the other person feel their own shame. Then came the man in the expensive suit, the one who dismissed her as some dog walker who wandered onto the rooftop of the elite. He launched into a flurry of excuses. "I didn't mean anything by it, really. I just didn't think you." Julia gently interrupted, still wearing that serene smile. "I don't need you to think anything of me. I just hope next time you won't assume anything about anyone based solely on how they look." Some apologies don't need to be accepted. Some lessons must remain like scars, etched into memory, so the indifference that caused them is never repeated. But Julia didn't retaliate. She didn't keep score of who insulted her, nor did she revel in their frantic attempts to undo the damage. She didn't walk away like someone who had won. She walked as someone who had never needed to prove anything, because real worth was never in the dress or the bag. It lies in how you treat someone who has nothing to offer you. And that, above all, is what separates the merely wealthy from the truly noble. 1 week after the incident that shook Harrison Tower, David officially held a press and art world gathering in the private gallery of their newly purchased penthouse. But what many expected to be a showcase of financial dominance became something entirely different, a deeply moving exhibition one, where people saw Mrs. Harrison not through the title of billionaire's wife, but through the brushstrokes of her own truth. There were no ball gowns, no diamonds. Julia appeared in a simple white linen dress, her hair tied up to reveal delicate features and a gaze so serene it felt as if she'd stepped out of a classical painting. But what truly left everyone speechless were the paintings adorning the gallery walls. They weren't luxurious, still lifes or high-priced commissioned portraits. They were fragments of real-life memories Julia had preserved in silence. A flower vendor in the chill of a winter morning, a homeless child curled up by a train station, the eyes of a waitress being insulted yet continuing to serve. Each painting told a story, a quiet symphony, without words, enough to make even the most powerful guests fall silent. David didn't stand on the center stage. He stayed at the back, letting Julia step forward alone, holding the microphone in hands that had once trembled from cold, from hunger, from rejection. And then she spoke, "I don't paint to impress. I paint to survive." Each of these paintings is of someone once overlooked, once dismissed, just like I was on a morning, right here in this very building. But today, I'm not here to criticize. I'm here to invite you to look again, not with judgment, but with real vision. Because sometimes what's most valuable lies behind a wrinkled layer of cloth. No one said a word. No one dared disturb the silence that followed. And in that moment, among those who once believed power resided in status, Julia quietly redefined it. Real power is the ability to make others look inward. The event ended not with fireworks or champagne, but with a long line of people waiting not for autographs, but to say thank you. And for the first time, the city's elite collectively bowed their heads, not before someone they admired, but before a woman who didn't need their admiration, and instead taught them how to see with their hearts. After the emotionally stirring exhibition, Julia thought she would quietly return to her usual rhythm painting as the sun rose, brewing tea at dusk and loving a man who had never asked her to change in order to be loved. But within 48 hours, her phone wouldn't stop ringing, not from media or reporters, but from museum directors, auction houses, and even prestigious galleries that had once rejected her work without so much as a reply. One of them was the director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He sent a handwritten letter, his handwriting shaky, more like a confession than an invitation. In it, he expressed his deep regret for once turning down Julia's street exhibit proposal and wished to now offer her a proper, deserving space where her work could be truly honored. It didn't stop there. An international media company wanted to make a documentary about her life. A luxury fashion house proposed a collaborative collection inspired by her art. Even the government reached out inviting her to lead an arts education program for underserved children titled Draw to See Humanity. David said nothing. He simply watched as she read letter after letter, flowing in like an unending stream. He never wanted to sway her. She was a self-sustaining flame, needing neither wind to burn brighter nor shelter to stay lit. Then Julia folded the letters and stacked them neatly on the table. She turned to David, her gaze gentle but resolute. "I'll accept only one invitation." "Which one?" he asked. Julia smiled. "From the little girl in the train station painting. I'm going to open a free art class for children who no one thinks deserve art." David didn't respond. He simply stepped forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead, not as a gesture of romance, but of reverence. That day, Julia turned down every spotlight, every compliment, every chance to become a globally celebrated artist. She chose to become a teacher, chose to return to the very places where no one had seen her. And from the penthouse, where the light was most perfect, she transformed a bare room into her first classroom, hanging children's drawings on the walls, taping scraps of their stories beside them, and writing in large letters on the door, "Here we don't ask who you are. We ask, what do you want to say with your art?" And just like that, the woman once rejected for her appearance became the one who opened a door for hundreds of other children to step into the world of art. No key, no resume, just a heart brave enough to draw the truest parts of themselves. 10 months after that fateful exhibition, Julia was seen at a public school on the outskirts of the city, not as an honored guest, not followed by TV crews, but simply as a woman carrying an old canvas bag, a few boxes of paint, and the gentle eyes of someone who had lived. The children were stunned at first. They weren't used to seeing someone famous get her hands stained with chalk and color, sitting cross-legged on the floor painting with each of them patiently. But it was her way of listening, not lecturing, not correcting, that opened up those small hearts. Julia didn't tell them they had to paint well. She simply said, "Paint to see the feelings inside yourself. Paint so no one can crush your dream just because you don't look like everyone else." And in the golden afternoons, sunlight poured through the classroom windows. The sound of laughter mixed with the scratch of pencils on paper. On those coarse sheets, Julia didn't just see the future of art, she saw herself at age 7, rejected from a class simply because she didn't have new shoes. News of her little class spread far and wide. Some called it a humanitarian arts center. Others dubbed her a living symbol of resilience. But Julia didn't care for titles. She didn't live to become a name that echoed. She lived to keep a promise to herself that if she ever got the chance to change the game, she wouldn't do it through revenge. She would change it by opening the door for those who had once been turned away just like she was. And then one afternoon, David brought her a draft proposal. It was the blueprint for founding the Julia Harrison Institute of Art, with her as honorary director. But Julia simply smiled and said, "Call it the Academy of the Forgotten, because it was they who helped me see myself." She didn't need applause from the world, because she understood sometimes a single drawing created with trembling but honest hands could shake a society that had long judged people by labels, instead of by their hearts. And that was Julia's victory, not because she was finally recognized, but because she no longer needed to be. 1 year after opening her first art class, Julia was invited to speak at the National Art Symposium, a gathering of the country's most prominent names in painting design and creative education. But in the grand hall glittering with stage lights, where many came expecting to hear keys to success, Julia chose instead to share a memory of when she was just a little girl, without even a decent box of crayons. "When I was young," she began, her voice low and steady, "I used to collect broken crayons from the trash bin behind the private school's art class. I knew they'd been tossed aside as useless, but I also knew those broken pieces saved me. I made art from what others had thrown away. The entire room fell silent. No camera shutters clicked, only the sound of people's hearts beating loudly because they realized the woman standing before them, eyes glowing with quiet strength, was not the product of privilege. She was the result of refusing to give up. In silence, Julia looked straight at the front row, where some of the same investors who once rejected her applications now sat. But there was no bitterness in her expression, only grace as she said, "I'm not telling this story to make anyone feel guilty. I'm telling it to remind you some talents don't come wrapped in a polished portfolio. Some souls worth investing in will never show up at your fancy parties. And if I'm standing here today, it's not because I'm better than anyone. It's because I didn't let shame silence the voice inside me." She paused, letting the moment linger. Then scanning the room, she added a line that made many look down. "In quiet shame, I used to be the kid people laughed at for drawing on a newspaper. Today, I teach other kids that the worth of a painting doesn't lie in the price of this paper, but in how true the dream behind it is." And with that, she bowed her head and walked off stage. No applause broke immediately, but not because they didn't admire her. It was because everyone in that moment was asking themselves the same question: how many dreams have I unknowingly crushed? Just by judging appearances, Julia didn't need glory. But in that moment, she delivered a lesson deeper than any golden statue or honorary degree could ever offer. Make art with your whole heart, and live as if every soul deserves to be heard, even when they're drawing with nothing more than broken crayons. If you're still sitting here quietly holding on to each scene of this story, then perhaps it's not because Julia stepped out of some glamorous world, but because somewhere within her you saw a reflection of yourself. Someone who once walked into an unfamiliar room with hesitation, who was looked down on just for not fitting into the standard, who was made to feel small in their own life. But instead of letting those wounds harden her, Julia chose the harder path: to remain silent, without breaking to be kind, without needing praise to be courageous, without needing to shout for validation. She didn't strike back with cutting words. She didn't need a stage to recount her pain, because what she did was far greater. She turned pain into light. She took fragments of the past, abandoned memories, and dreams once drowned, and built a bridge. And with that bridge, she carried not just herself, but others who had once been forgotten, toward a world more just, more humane. The greatest lesson in this story is not in the success Julia eventually reached, but in her quiet, unwavering choices, in the smallest, most overlooked moments. In a world filled with loud voices, Julia reminds us sometimes simply staying compassionate in silence, being kind when no one sees, and holding on when no one believes in you. It is an extraordinary act, and you can do that too. I don't know where you are in your journey. You might be misunderstood, feel invisible, or be wondering if kindness still matters. But if Julia's story moved you, that's the sign that there's still a part of you that refuses to give up. A part that knows our worth isn't defined by what we wear, what we own, or what others call us, but by how we choose to live when no one's watching. So let yourself keep believing in kindness, in dreams that seem small, and in the light that comes from within you. If this story touched your heart, don't leave in silence. Leave a message of feeling, because maybe you'll be the one offering hope to someone who desperately needs it. And don't forget to subscribe to Talk Story so you won't miss the stories that not only move us, but make us stronger, braver, and kinder in a world that needs more hearts like Julia's and like yours.